I'm not even going to make any introduction because truly you guys need no introduction. I'm just going to leave Winston Smith to ask some interesting questions here.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Winston Smith, and I'm going to be participating in this very, very interesting and exciting event in a couple of different ways. This first part of my participation involves talking to three musicians who are very significant in Canadian music. At this point, we have Oliver Jones, who for many, many years has been one of the stellar figures in Canadian music. He hails from the city of Montreal. Montreal seems to have a very sort of magical history and heritage in the music. He has recorded a number of albums over the years, traveled all over the world, and really has kind of left us, and we're going to talk to Oliver a little bit about that, but certainly has left us as well a tremendous recorded legacy of music. And we also have Joe Seeley, who is sitting at the far end, and Joe Seeley, again with that Montreal, but this time a slightly different variation / Halifax connection, and for the last few years, obviously a Toronto profile as well. And Joe has, over the years, worked in all areas of music. Indeed, and one of the questions I certainly will have for him has to do with his sometimes reluctance to be thought of as a jazz musician as such, and we'll try to get to that a little bit. But Joe has been quite notable, not only for his participation in a number of productions, television and dramatic, but as well for a very important recording he made a number of years ago, his Africville Suite. And for many of you who have a knowledge of Halifax and of, unfortunately, that late lamented part of Halifax, Joe's recording serves as a memorial and a celebration of that history. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about this city of Montreal, and I want to ask Oliver Jones a little bit about why Montreal seems to have such significance in our history. Certainly, we've seen any number of very, very important musicians come from the city, and Montreal continues to be vital not only for its jazz festival in the summer, but for all kinds of creative and experimental music that happens there. Oliver, can you tell us a little bit about the city of Montreal and your growing up in it?
Well, I would say that Montreal, from the early 30s, was a very, very vibrant city. At one point, we had, I believe, 637 clubs going, and more than 450 of them had music in them, live music. And of course, we had a period from, I would say, the mid-40s in which an awful lot of black American jazz musicians decided that they, or I should say, fell in love with the city and decided to stay. And they formed really the basic foundation for the jazz community in Montreal. And I think that the city itself had so much going for it as far as nightclub, and of course the clubs never close. So when we thought of Toronto or Ontario at all, we used to laugh when they think that they were finished at 12 o'clock, and we were still, some of the second groups were just going on at 12 and 1 o'clock. So I think this established a basic wonderland for musicians, not only the locals, but a lot of Americans coming in.
Okay. And how about maybe varying the question a little bit, just because while we know that Oliver lived in the city for years, but also left Canada for a number of years, and we'll come back to that. Joe, you hail from Montreal and then sort of emigrated a little bit east, but tell me a little bit about the Montreal of your time, being slightly younger than Oliver in that way.
Only slightly. I recall as a teenager going to places like the Emanon Jazz Society, which was in the CJAD building, I think, on Mountain Street, and being enthralled by so many musicians. And a lot of them, like Oliver said, were expatriate New Yorkers and other parts of the States that had come and fallen in love with Montreal, the culture, the ladies, and they decided to abandon. I work with guys that basically abandoned New York. They just loved the lifestyle in Montreal. But I remember as early as 14 listening to great musicians playing, jamming on Saturday afternoons, and I was caught up in it. And it was a very exciting city, right until, I would say, 1958. 1958 is when I think it was Sarto Fournier decided that Montreal will no longer be a wide open city. I remember my first. Was it Drapeau? Oh, it was Drapeau. Okay, good. Yeah, because I remember my first summer working at the Café Caprice, and I lived on the South Shore. And this is the other thing. I wasn't really, from the time I was 8 years old, I was brought up in the sticks, in the suburbs. And so it wasn't until I was old enough to come into Montreal that I started really taking part in the life. But I remember walking home after going to Ben's after my 2 o'clock gig finished, walking down St. Catherine Street past the Tip Top Club. It would be 5:15, and I'd hear the speaker on the sidewalk saying, Dernier spectacle, the last show was just starting at 5:15 in the morning. And then the next year, Mayor Drapeau closed down the whole city. And what was the latest you could stay? Was 2 o'clock, I think it was after that?
They were able to drink until 2, and they had to be out of the clubs by 3.
Which,
last call was at...
Yeah, it was pretty shocking to a lot of the local residents, but of course...
And we were screaming about that.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, when I moved to Toronto, the clubs are closing at 12 o'clock. So, I said, wow, I guess nobody had anything really to complain about in those days. But that's just one aspect of it. Going to university was really great. Sir George Williams, there were a lot of European cafes around, and Montreal had a very strong European influence, which is why jazz thrived there a lot easier than it did in other areas. The Europeans have always had an affinity for jazz, much more so than North Americans per se. And with that strong European influence, there were little jazz clubs and coffee houses. I remember jamming at Cafe Vienna, the little Vienna, which is really close to Sir George. And they brought in Sun Ra one year. Can you imagine? Sun Ra. I actually sat in with his band. I mean, it was just an incredible time. It was very vibrant, and it's just really wonderful time to be.
And also, it's interesting because both of you have alluded to the sense of expatriation. We have this issue certainly in terms of the development of jazz in Canada of Americans who migrated north, and certainly the foundations might be found there. But the other side of this is also taking it a little bit from a little bit more of a domestic perspective and thinking about another series of migrations. Oliver, for instance, with your family coming from the West Indies and coming from Barbados. More specifically, we know that jazz certainly has a very strong and enduring Caribbean heritage and relationship as well. What was the encounter like for West Indians who had come into Montreal and then had become exposed not only to the culture, the French and the European culture there, but also to the African-American element who had migrated north and started sort of developing much of what we think of as the contemporary jazz scene there?
Well, I'd have to say that I remember my godfather, Mr. Paris, father of Richard Paris, a wonderful saxophonist, and he had the largest collection of calypso. So I grew up probably at the age of 3 starting to play the music. But by the same token, when I started to do my studies at the age of 6.5, by then I had started to listen to all of the standard things that were on the radio at that time. Those were the good old standards that you learned from a very, very early age. And I don't think that my parents, or very many of them, embrace this music they used to call boogie woogie. Although my first concert when I was 5, at the Union United Church, a place where I'm certain that Joe has played many times, we used to have these concerts, and I can remember Mrs. Wade, Steve Wade's mother. Steve was one of the greatest musicians that we had, and they would say, well, this boogie woogie is all right for the time being, but don't take it serious. It's not going to last. And but it was the time of the day, the music of the day, and so I embraced that also. And then plus the start of my classical studies. So for me, Winston, I always had an opportunity to play enough of everything, and that's why I have always said that I was a much better commercial pianist than I ever was a jazz pianist.
Now, it's interesting that you would in some way erect that kind of divide, because we know that jazz has always fed very much from many of these different areas of popular music, and certainly there's a synthesis that has always been vital to the music. So don't you think perhaps this so-called popular music in your background has pretty much influenced and I think helped you to develop the kind of voice that you developed as a jazz musician?
Without a doubt. Also, I know that Joe could attest to this. In those clubs, Winston, during that time, every single club had a show. And so you had the opportunity to learn to accompany artists. When we speak of shows today, we're talking about one singer. I have accompanied seals, horses, pigeons, chimpanzees, and would you believe even fish on stage. There was so much variety. There was always dancers, there was always magicians. So I think we grew up learning a very, very important aspect of music, and that's being able to be the accomplished accompanist. And I think that I got most of my training from working with singers and dancers over the years. For many, many years, I worked with a cousin of mine, Charles Griffith, who had a dance school, and at least twice a year we had the recitals. And of course we were playing jazz music, Sheik of Araby and so forth, all of the things of that era. And I think it gave me the opportunity to learn all about everything that was pertaining to music. Plus, I was still studying. Very badly, I must say, but I still was studying.
Not as badly as me.
Now, from the perspective of again, having a broad, a very Catholic knowledge of musical styles and forms, Joe, I know that you have on occasion been reluctant to accept the conventions of the classification jazz musician. Certainly this is, I think, not something that's new, because this is a term and certainly it is an historical issue in terms of any number of jazz musicians or people who are categorized as such. But maybe perhaps complementing Oliver, but as well differing from him, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your reasons for not wanting to sort of wear that mantle.
Well, I think that it stems, I should qualify that, but perhaps I can get to that. I think it really stems from the fact that my education coming up in Montreal, as Oliver said, was so eclectic. I played for strippers, I played for shows, I played in a lot of dance bands with musicians like Buddy Jordan and B.T. Lundy, who are expatriate New Yorkers. But they learned to survive. We had to play all kinds of music, and particularly with the French influence as well as the Latin American influence. I mean, when you did a job, you not only had to play, you could play jazz and ballads and some of the popular tunes of the day, but you had to know how to play a cha-cha, a samba, a mambo, a merengue. I mean, it was such an eclectic background. I mean, this was all part of survival, but it was also part of my education. And as a result of it, now, when I say I'm more reluctant to categorize myself as a jazz musician, because I find that throughout my career, perhaps it's my short attention span. I'll play jazz for a while, and then I'll go do a show, and then I'll do something else. And it's very difficult for me to stay doing any one thing and calling myself one thing. I don't, in a sense, I feel in a small way, I am a jazz musician because all my instincts are jazz, but I perhaps haven't earned it because I haven't dedicated myself solely to playing jazz and developing jazz and all that involves. I mean, I know jazz musicians, that's what they do. They eat, sleep, breathe, and that's all they want to do, and that's all they do, and they do everything they can to be the best. I am probably more of I have a much broader base, I feel, in the things I do, and also because of my short attention span, I find I have to keep bouncing from one to another just to keep myself awake.
Now, for this short attention span, however, and you alluded a few minutes ago to your education, you attended for a while Sir George Williams, and you also went off to the U.S. to Berkeley as well. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the formal training that you received in those years?
Well, as I said, I was at a bit of a disadvantage because when I was 8 years old, I decided my parents had bought a piece of property in a place called Villers-Cartier, and we used to go over there in the summer. We built a little cabin. Well, after grade 3, that summer, I really liked the open spaces, because we were living downtown on Cristal Street, which was right off Atwater between Saint Jacques and Saint Antoine, and yeah, exactly. There you go. And there weren't many wide open spaces where a young guy could just sort of run around and be wild and not get into trouble or too much trouble, or at least not get hit by a car or something. So my parents acquiesced, and they actually during that summer started building a house. So from the time I was 9 years old, I lived in the suburbs. Lessons were very hard to come by there. For a while I studied with the next door neighbor. She had 21 children, and whenever I went over for a lesson, there were at least 15 of them there. So it was very distracting, to say the least. So after about 2 years with her, I decided that this wasn't going anywhere, but I just kept wanting to play the piano. And of course my parents were rightfully concerned that I get a formal education. So they would find me another teacher. Well, by the time I was old enough to cross the bridge by myself, I suppose I was 12 or 13, that's when I really feel that my studying really started when I was fortunate enough to study with Daisy Peterson Sweeney for about a year and a half, and she tried her best to bring me up to speed. But and then after her, I went to a fellow by the name of Professor Boyce. Do you remember? On Park Avenue. Well, Professor Boyce taught 13 different instruments, played them all very badly. But he understood the mechanics of playing them. Like I would come in for my lesson and a trombone player would be walking out, and after my lesson there'd be a violin player walking in there. And also he had a very gorgeous daughter, Florence, who was always a treat to look at when I went there. So I studied with Professor Boyce for a while. And then I started working in the Montreal scene with the jazz musicians. Bob Rudd, one day on a gig in Three Rivers, he said, "Junior, those changes you're playing ain't right. You got to get together with a guy that I can turn you on to." Well, there's a fellow in Montreal called Bob Langlois, who was considered the Bill Evans of Canada. And my lessons were really a pivotal point for me. The hour lesson usually lasted 3.5 or 4 because so much time we would listen to stuff. He had me playing anything from blues to Rachmaninoff. But he was a fascinating person. So then I went to Sir George Williams. I was in with the jazz musicians at this time. It had the best jazz society. I didn't do particularly well in university, but I really did play a lot of great music. And all the musicians used to come to Sir George. After 2 years of this, realizing it's one of the most boldest thing I ever did. I realized that I was working, I was doing gigs, they weren't really happening for me. I couldn't see any real future in what I was doing, and yet I knew the truth was out there. I enlisted myself in the Royal Canadian Navy because I thought, I need discipline and I can't do it. And I thought that would do it. And it did in a way, except I learned how to get around that system too. But while I was there, they posted me in Halifax. I became secretary-treasurer of the Jazz Club. We brought in a group. The fellow from Halifax was studying in Berkeley, Skip Beckwith. So we phoned him up. We said we had some money. He brought up 3 musicians with him.